Friday night lights in Fredericksburg, Texas, meant something more than football. It meant the whole town gathering in the bleachers, meant generations of families sitting in the same spots their grandparents had claimed, meant the smell of popcorn and cut grass, and that particular September heat that didn't know when to quit. The Battle Billies were playing their first home game of the season, and the stands were packed by 6:30, an hour before kickoff. Earl Jessup made his way up the aluminum steps one at a time, his walker clanking against the metal with each careful movement. 89 years old, and he still refused the wheelchair his daughter kept trying to force on him. "I walked off Iwo Jima on my own 2 feet, he'd told her last week. "I can walk up some bleachers." That had been bravado. The truth was harder. His knees burned with every step, his lungs couldn't find enough air, and the Purple Heart pinned to his VFW jacket felt heavier than it had in 79 years. But his grandson Tyler was starting at linebacker tonight, first game of his senior year, and Earl would be damned if he missed it. "Mr. Jessup, let me help you with that." Coach Martinez appeared at his elbow, steady hands ready to assist. Earl waved him off with more force than necessary. "I've got it, Coach. You worry about the game." "Yes, sir." Martinez knew better than to argue. Everyone in Fredericksburg knew Earl Jessup, knew the stories about the Pacific, about the company he'd lost on that black sand beach, about the 50 years he'd spent afterwards never talking about any of it. His wife Clara had been the only one he'd opened up to, and she'd been gone 2 years now. These days, Earl came to the games and sat alone, high in the stands where he could see everything, and nobody bothered him except to shake his hand and thank him for his service. He made it to his usual spot, 3rd row from the top near the aisle, and lowered himself onto the bench with a grunt. The walker folded beside him. Below, the band was warming up, brass notes floating through the evening air like scattered prayers. The cheerleaders practiced their routines on the track. Parents clustered near the fence, taking photos, calling out to their kids. Earl pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket and looked at it the way he did before every game. Faded, creased, the edges soft as cloth. 23 men in Marine uniforms standing in front of a transport ship, grinning like they had no idea what was coming. He was in the front row, second from the left. 19 years old. By the time they'd taken Suribachi, only 7 of them were still alive. "That your unit, sir?" Earl looked up. A man had settled onto the bench beside him, younger, maybe 40, with a leather vest over a plain black shirt and the kind of tattoos that said military, even before Earl noticed the ink on his forearm. Fallujah, 2004-2005, in stark black letters. 5th Marine Division, Earl said. February, 45. "Iwo Jima." The man nodded slowly. "My grandfather was Army, Pacific Theater. Never talked about it." "Most of us didn't." The man extended his hand. "Manny Delgado. People call me Roadhouse." Earl shook it. "Earl Jessup. People call me Earl." A hint of a smile crossed Manny's face. "Fair enough, Earl. Mind if I sit here? I was just passing through, heard the band, figured I'd stop and watch a quarter or two. Free country, or so they tell me." Manny settled in, his motorcycle helmet resting on the bench beside him. Down on the field, the teams were emerging from their locker rooms, helmets gleaming under the stadium lights. Earl spotted Tyler immediately, number 52, tall and broad, moving with the easy confidence of a young man who didn't yet know how quickly everything could change. "Grandson," Earl said, pointing. "Tyler, first game as a starter." That's something to be proud of. His grandmother would have loved this. She never missed a game. Earl tucked the photograph back into his pocket. 2 years now. Still catch myself looking for her in the stands. Manny didn't offer condolences or platitudes. He just nodded, his eyes on the field, giving Earl the space to feel what he felt without making it a thing. Earl appreciated that. Most people didn't know how to be around grief. They wanted to fix it, smooth it over, wrap it in casseroles and sympathy cards. This man understood that some things just had to be carried. The PA system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for our national anthem." Earl reached for his walker. Getting up was harder than getting down, always was, but he'd stood for the anthem at every game since Korea, and he wasn't about to stop now. His knees screamed, his back seized, but he pulled himself upright, one hand on the walker, the other pressed against his chest where the Purple Heart hung. The band began to play. Around him, The crowd stood with varying degrees of attention, some with hands over hearts, some checking their phones, some talking quietly to friends. Earl didn't judge. He'd fought for their right to do whatever they wanted. He just knew what he had to do. "Excuse me, sir?" A woman had appeared in the aisle, her face tight with annoyance. She was dressed too formally for a football game. Blazer, pearls, a campaign button pinned to her lapel that read, "Hawkins for County Commissioner." Behind her, a family was trying to find their seats, blocked by Earl's standing form and his walker. "Sir, you're blocking the aisle. Could you please sit down?" Earl stared at her. "The anthem's playing." "I understand that, but you're making it difficult for people to get to their seats, and frankly," she lowered her voice, leaning closer, "you're making some of the parents uncomfortable. The shaking, it's distracting." The shaking. Earl looked down at his hands, gripping the walker, trembling with the effort of staying upright. He hadn't noticed. He never did anymore. "I'm standing for the anthem," he said, his voice flat. "There's no law that says you have to. And with your condition, I'm sure no one would judge you for sitting. Ma'am, I didn't stand on Iwo Jima so someone could tell me to sit during my own anthem." The woman's face flushed. Around them, people were starting to notice. Heads turning, whispers spreading through the nearby rows. The anthem played on, the band reaching the high notes of "The Rocket's Red Glare." But the attention had shifted from the flag to the old man with the walker and the woman in the blazer. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice," she said. "This is a family event. Lady." Manny's voice cut through, quiet but hard. He was on his feet now, helmet in his hands, his eyes fixed on the woman with an intensity that made her step back. "The man is a combat veteran. He's wearing a Purple Heart, and you're asking him to sit down during the anthem because his hands shake? I don't see how that's any of your... I'm making it my business." Manny's hands tightened on the helmet. His jaw was clenched, something dark moving behind his eyes that Earl recognized from his own mirror. The look of a man fighting a battle no one else could see. The anthem ended. The crowd began to sit, but Earl stayed standing, his whole body trembling now, caught between pride and humiliation, watching this stranger defend him while the woman sputtered and the whispers grew louder. On the field, Tyler had turned to look up at the stands, searching for his grandfather. His face changed when he saw what was happening. Confusion, then anger, then something that made Earl's heart clench. His grandson started walking toward the bleachers. "Tyler, no," Earl muttered. "Stay on the field. Don't..." But it was too late. The game hadn't even started, and already everything was falling apart. Coach Martinez intercepted Tyler before he reached the fence. Earl couldn't hear what was said, but he saw the coach's hands on his grandson's shoulders, saw Tyler's helmet come off, saw the argument that followed. Tyler gesturing toward the stands, Martinez shaking his head, pointing back toward the field where the team was gathering for the opening kickoff. Tyler looked up at Earl one more time, his face a war between duty and family. Earl raised his hand. "I'm fine. Go play," and watched his grandson turn away, pull on his helmet, and jog back to his teammates. "Sir, I think we should all sit down now." The woman, Hawkins according to her button, had regained her composure. "The incident is over. Let's not make it worse." "The incident?" Earl lowered himself onto the bench, his legs giving out more than choosing to sit. "Is that what you call telling an old man he's too broken to honor his country?" "I was trying to help. You were clearly struggling." "I've been struggling for 79 years, ma'am. It's never stopped me before." Hawkins opened her mouth to respond, but Manny stepped between them, his broad shoulders blocking her view of Earl. "I think you should find another seat," he said quietly. "Somewhere far away from here." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm suggesting you leave before this gets any more attention than it already has." Manny tilted his head toward the crowd, where phones were out and recording. "You're running for office, right? County Commissioner? Might want to think about what those videos are going to look like on the news tomorrow." Hawkins went pale. She glanced around at the faces watching her, some sympathetic, most not, and seemed to shrink inside her blazer. Without another word, she turned and made her way down the bleachers, her family trailing behind her like ducklings who sensed the water had turned dangerous. Manny sat back down beside Earl. "You okay?" "I've had worse." Earl's hands were still shaking, but whether from anger or exhaustion, he couldn't tell anymore. "Didn't need you to fight my battles. Didn't seem like a fair fight. Figured I'd even the odds. I don't need evening. I'm not some fragile old... Earl stopped, took a breath. He sounded like a stubborn fool, and he knew it. Sorry, I'm not good at this. At what? People helping me. Never have been. He stared down at the field where the kickoff was sailing through the warm night air. Clara used to say I'd rather drown than ask someone to throw me a rope. Sounds like Clara was a smart woman. Smarter than me. Stayed married to me for 63 years anyway. Earl found himself almost smiling. She would have liked you. She always said I needed more friends who didn't take my crap. I'll take that as a compliment. They watched the first quarter in something close to comfortable silence. Tyler made 3 tackles and a sack, drawing cheers from the home crowd and a fierce pride from Earl that burned through the lingering humiliation of the Anthem incident. By halftime, the Billies were up by 14, and the night had settled into the familiar rhythms of small-town Texas football. The band playing fight songs, kids running along the fence, old men arguing about calls they could barely see. You served in Iraq, Earl said during a timeout. Fallujah, that was a rough one. Manny nodded, his eyes on something far away. Second battle, November '04, worst month of my life. He paused. Only month that felt like living. Earl understood that better than most people would. The way combat stripped everything down to essentials, fear and focus, brothers and bullets, the simple clarity of knowing what mattered and what didn't. Coming home was harder than going over. Always had been. You doing okay now? Earl asked. I mean, that's a stupid question. Forget I asked. It's not stupid. Manny turned the helmet over in his hands, tracing the scratches in the paint. Some days are better than others. I ride because it helps. Being on the road, engine underneath me, wind in my face, it's the closest I get to feeling normal. You got people? Family? Had a wife. She left 3 years ago. Said she couldn't compete with ghosts. His jaw tightened. She wasn't wrong. I wasn't easy to live with. Drank too much, slept too little, jumped at sounds that weren't there. She tried. I'll give her that. But trying isn't the same as succeeding. Kids? A daughter, Sophia. She's 14 now. Something soft crossed Manny's face, then hardened again. She lives with her mom in Austin. I see her when I can, but... He shook his head. She looks at me like she's waiting for me to disappear, like I'm already half gone. Earl thought about Tyler's face when he'd seen the commotion in the stands. That same look, part fear, part resignation, the expression of someone who loved you but couldn't count on you anymore. My daughter thinks I should be in a home, Earl said. Assisted living, they call it. She's been at me for 2 years, ever since Clara passed. Says I can't take care of myself. Says I'm a danger. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. I survived 36 days on an island where the ground was made of dead men, and she thinks I can't handle a house in Fredericksburg. Maybe she's just scared. Of what? Of losing you the way she lost her mother. Manny's voice was gentle, the kind of gentle that came from understanding. People do strange things when they're scared. Push away, try to control, anything to feel like they've got a grip on something that can't be gripped. Earl didn't answer. Down on the field, the teams were lining up for the second half kickoff. Tyler was bouncing on his toes near the sideline, ready to go back in. The boy had no idea what was waiting for him, the years that would pile up like stones, the losses that would hollow him out, the day he'd look in the mirror and see an old man looking back and wonder where the time had gone. There was a moment on Iwo Jima, Earl said, the words coming unbidden. Third day. We were pinned down near an airfield, taking fire from a pillbox we couldn't see. My sergeant, man named Pete Dalton, best Marine I ever knew. He stood up to draw fire so the rest of us could move. He knew what he was doing. We all knew. Earl's voice caught. Took 3 rounds in the chest. Lived long enough to see us take the position. Died in my arms, saying something I couldn't hear. Manny was silent, waiting. I've spent 79 years wondering what he was trying to tell me. Every night, right before I fall asleep, I see his mouth moving and I can't hear the words. Earl looked at the photograph in his pocket, though he didn't take it out. That woman, Hawkins, she looked at me like I was an inconvenience, like my shaking hands were a problem she had to solve. But these hands carried Pete Dalton off that airfield. These hands buried 4 of my friends in sand so black it looked like coal. And I'll be damned if I let some politician in pearls tell me they're not steady enough to honor the flag we died for. She shouldn't have said what. She said, no, but she did. Earl finally looked at Manny, and now I've got to figure out what to do about it. What do you mean? I mean, she's running for office. I mean, half the town saw what happened. I mean, my grandson left his team to come defend me, and people are going to have opinions about that. Earl's jaw set. I didn't want any of this. I just wanted to watch my boy play football. That's still all you have to do. The rest of it, that's her problem, not yours. In a town this size, everything's everyone's problem. Earl gestured at the crowd around them, neighbors, friends, people who'd known him for decades. By tomorrow morning, there'll be two sides, the ones who think she was out of line and the ones who think I was making a scene. By Monday, it'll be in the newspaper. By next week, Tyler won't be able to walk down the hall without someone asking about his crazy grandpa and the Anthem lady. Manny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, what if there was a way to change the story? What story? The one people are going to tell. Right now, it's about a confrontation. An old man and a politician going at it in the stands. But stories can be changed, reframed. He looked at Earl with something that might have been the beginning of a plan. What if it became about something else, something bigger than one moment in the bleachers? Earl studied the younger man's face. What are you thinking? I'm thinking I know some people. Veterans, most of them. Guys who ride, who show up when it matters. Manny pulled out his phone. I'm thinking that maybe this town needs a reminder of what it looks like when people stand together, not against anyone, just for something. For the men and women who served, for the ones who came home shaking and the ones who didn't come home at all. You're talking about a demonstration. I'm talking about a statement, a peaceful one, the kind that doesn't argue or accuse, just shows up and says, we remember, we honor, we stand. Manny met Earl's eyes. You interested? Earl thought about Clara, who had spent 63 years standing beside him, about Tyler, who had been ready to leave his team to defend him, about Pete Dalton, dying on black sand with words Earl would never hear. Make your calls, he said. Manny was already dialing. The news spread faster than Earl had expected. By Saturday afternoon, the video from the stands had been shared 3,000 times on social media, with comments ranging from outrage to support to the particular venom that strangers saved for strangers on the internet. By Sunday morning, the Fredericksburg Standard had run a front-page story with the headline, Confrontation at Friday Night Game Sparks Debate, and Earl's phone hadn't stopped ringing since. He stopped answering after the fourth call from reporters. His daughter Linda drove up from San Antonio that afternoon, her face tight with the kind of worry that always preceded a lecture. Dad, this is exactly what I was afraid of. She paced his living room while he sat in Clara's old chair, watching her wear a path in the carpet. You're all over the news. People are talking. That Hawkins woman is threatening to sue for defamation. She can't sue me for telling the truth. She can sue you for anything she wants. Whether she wins or not isn't the point. Linda stopped pacing and faced him, her arms crossed. The point is that you're 89 years old. You have a heart condition. You have no business getting into public fights with political candidates. I didn't get into a fight. She told me to sit down during the anthem. I said no. And then some biker you don't even know made a scene defending you, and now there's going to be some kind of, what? Rally? Protest? Linda's voice rose. Dad, this isn't you. You've never been political. You've never wanted attention. What's changed? Earl thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated. Wrapped up in Clara's absence, in the photograph of 23 men he still carried in his pocket, in the look on Tyler's face when he'd seen his grandfather being humiliated. He wasn't sure he understood it himself. Maybe I'm tired of being quiet, he finally said. Maybe I've spent 79 years keeping my head down, and maybe that woman reminded me why I shouldn't have to. Dad, Linda, I love you. I know you're trying to protect me, but I don't need protection. I need to be able to stand for the anthem without some stranger telling me I'm too broken to do it. He met her eyes. Manny and his friends are coming Friday. They're going to stand with me, not against anyone, just for something. And I need you to either support that or step aside. Linda stared at him for a long moment. Something in her face shifted. Not acceptance, exactly, but the recognition that this wasn't an argument she could win. "I'll be there," she said quietly. "If you're going to do something foolish, at least you won't do it alone." The week crawled by. Tyler came over twice after practice, sitting on the porch with his grandfather and asking questions about Iwo Jima that Earl had never answered before. There was a hunger in the boy that Earl recognized, the need to understand where he came from, what his family had sacrificed, what it meant to carry a name that had been carried through fire and blood. "I looked you up," Tyler said on Thursday night, the eve of the game. "There's a record online. 5th Marine Division, casualties and awards. Your name is on there." "A lot of names on that list. But yours is there. Purple Heart, Bronze Star. Grandpa, you never told me about any of that." Earl looked at his hands, still trembling, always trembling now. "Didn't seem worth talking about. The men who deserved medals were the ones who didn't come home." "Pete Dalton?" The name hit Earl like a punch. He'd mentioned Pete to Manny, but hadn't realized Tyler had been paying attention. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Pete most of all." Tyler was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "What was he like?" And Earl, for the first time in 79 years, told someone, really told them. Not the sanitized version, not the Veterans Hall stories polished smooth by repetition, but the truth. Pete's laugh, loud and sudden, the way he read letters from his girl back home out loud, like he was performing for an audience. The night before the landing, when Pete had sat beside Earl on the transport deck and talked about what he wanted to do after the war, open a hardware store in Michigan, marry his sweetheart, raise a bunch of kids with her eyes. "He was the best of us," Earl said, his voice breaking. "And he died, so the rest of us could live. I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of that. Most days, I'm not sure I've come close." Tyler didn't say anything. He just reached over and took his grandfather's hand, those trembling, scarred hands that had carried men through fire, and held it. Friday arrived with the smell of rain in the air, clouds piling up over the hill country like they couldn't decide whether to storm or scatter. Earl, dressed in his VFW jacket, pinned Clara's wedding ring to the inside pocket beside his photograph, and drove to the stadium 2 hours before kickoff. Manny was waiting in the parking lot. Behind him, arranged in neat rows, were over 100 motorcycles. Earl stopped walking. He hadn't expected this. Manny had talked about some people, about guys who ride. But this was something else. A sea of chrome and leather, men and women, standing beside their bikes, patches on their vests from a dozen different clubs, Texas Veterans MC, Hill Country Riders, Lone Star Patriots, names Earl had never heard but recognized in the way you recognized family. They'd come from across the state, some from farther, because one man had made some calls and told them the story. "Earl," Manny approached, helmet under his arm, "I want you to meet some friends." The next hour was a blur of handshakes and introductions, names Earl would never remember and faces he would never forget. A woman named Rosa, whose son had died in Afghanistan. A man called Digger, who'd lost his legs in Iraq and rode a custom trike with hand controls. A kid no older than Tyler who said his father had served with Manny in Fallujah and wanted to be here to represent the family. They all had stories, they all had reasons, and they all had one thing in common. They understood what it meant to stand. At 6:30, the trouble arrived. A county sheriff's cruiser pulled into the lot, followed by 2 more. An officer Earl didn't recognize, young, nervous, clearly unhappy about his assignment, approached the gathering with a clipboard in his hands. "Which one of you is Emmanuel Delgado?" Manny stepped forward. "That's me." "Sir, I've received a complaint about an unpermitted assembly. I'm going to need you to disperse this group." "On what grounds?" "Public safety." "Concerns. The complaint alleges that your group intends to engage in intimidation and harassment of a county commissioner candidate." The officer glanced at his clipboard like it held the answers to questions he hadn't thought to ask. "I've been authorized to issue citations to anyone who refuses to leave." Earl felt the mood shift, a ripple of tension moving through the crowd. Some of the riders were already reaching for their helmets, their faces hardening into the look of people who had dealt with authority before and didn't intend to back down. "Hold on." Earl pushed through to stand beside Manny. "Who filed this complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to say, sir, but you can tell me whether they had any evidence of intended harassment. Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a group of veterans who want to attend a football game." Earl gestured at the bikes, at the men and women who had ridden hours to be here. "We're not blocking traffic. We're not making threats. We're just standing." The officer hesitated. Behind him, his colleagues shifted uncomfortably, caught between their orders and the reality of what they were being asked to do. Disperse 100 combat veterans for the crime of showing up. "Sir, I have my orders. And I have a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star and 79 years of trying to figure out what they were for." Earl's voice rose, carrying across the parking lot. "I didn't earn those medals so some politician could use the sheriff's department to silence people she disagrees with. And I suspect you didn't become a cop to be someone's errand boy." The young officer's face reddened. For a long moment, the parking lot held its breath. Then a voice came from behind the riders, a voice Earl knew. "Officer Davis." Coach Martinez walked forward from the edge of the crowd, where he'd been watching without being noticed. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. These folks are my guests. I invited them to attend tonight's game as part of our annual Veterans Appreciation Night." The officer blinked. "Veterans Appreciation Night?" "That's right. Been planning it for weeks. Isn't that right, Principal Howard?" Earl turned. A woman in her 50s had joined Martinez, the high school principal, whom Earl recognized from Tyler's award ceremonies. She nodded firmly. "Absolutely. We've been coordinating with the VFW for months. The athletic department has reserved seating for our honored guests, and we'll be recognizing local veterans during the halftime ceremony." She smiled at the officer with the particular warmth of someone who knew exactly how to handle bureaucracy. "I'm sure whoever filed that complaint simply wasn't aware of our plans. You know how these things get miscommunicated." Officer Davis looked at his clipboard, at the crowd, at the two school officials who had materialized with the convenient certainty of a prepared alibi. Earl watched the calculation happen, the kid weighing his orders against the reality of arresting 100 veterans and 2 school administrators on the basis of a political complaint that was already falling apart. "I'll need to confirm this with my captain," Davis said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need." Principal Howard's smile didn't waver. "We'll be inside, enjoying the game." The officers retreated to their cruisers. Manny turned to Martinez with something like awe on his face. "Veterans Appreciation Night?" "It is now." Martinez grinned. "I figured we might need a backup plan. Couldn't let Earl here fight this battle alone." He clapped the old man on the shoulder. "You ready, sir?" Earl looked at the crowd, the 100-plus riders who had come from across Texas to stand with him, the coaches and principals who had stepped up without being asked, the grandson warming up on the field, who had no idea what was about to happen. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." The first engine started, a low rumble that built and built until the whole parking lot shook with it. Then, one by one, the riders dismounted, removed their helmets, and walked toward the stadium together. Not a demonstration, not a protest, just Americans going to watch a football game and daring anyone to tell them to sit down. The stadium had never seen anything like it. They filled the bleachers from bottom to top, a sea of leather vests and military patches and American flags that appeared from nowhere, passed hand to hand until the whole visitors section was draped in red, white, and blue. Local families made room without being asked, shifting seats, sharing benches, pulling children onto laps so the veterans could sit together. By the time the teams took the field for warm-ups, there wasn't an empty space in the house. Earl sat in his usual spot, third row from the top near the aisle, but nothing else was usual. Manny was beside him, and beyond Manny stretched a row of men and women who had ridden hundreds of miles to stand with a stranger. Linda had found a seat 2 rows down, her face still tight with worry, but her presence saying what her words couldn't. And somewhere in that crowd, Earl knew, were people recording everything, not to cause trouble, but to witness, to make sure the story got told right this time. Tyler spotted them during warm-ups. Earl watched his grandson freeze mid-stretch, his eyes moving across the packed stands, taking in the scope of what had happened. The boy's face went through a dozen emotions, confusion, recognition, something that might have been pride. He raised his hand toward Earl, a small wave, and Earl raised his back. "He's going to play his heart out tonight," Manny said. "He always does. But tonight," Earl's voice caught. "Tonight he knows why it matters." The PA system crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for our national anthem." Earl reached for his walker. Around him, every veteran in the stands was doing the same. standing slowly, deliberately, the way old soldiers stood. The ones who couldn't rise on their own were helped by the ones who could. Digger, the man with no legs, pushed himself up on his armrests until he was balanced on his prosthetics, swaying slightly but upright. Rosa, whose son had died in Afghanistan, stood with tears already streaming down her face. And then, like a wave rolling through the stadium, the rest of the crowd rose with them. Not just the veterans section, not just the home side, everyone. Parents and children, teenagers and grandparents, people who had been strangers an hour ago and were now part of something they didn't fully understand but could feel in their bones. They rose because the veterans rose. They stood because standing was what you did. The band began to play. Earl placed his hand over his heart, feeling Clara's ring press against his chest through the fabric of his jacket. The trembling was there, always there now, but it didn't matter. He wasn't shaking alone. He looked down at the field, where Tyler had removed his helmet and was standing at attention with his teammates. The boy's eyes found Earl's across the distance, and something passed between them that didn't need words. A promise, a legacy. The understanding that some things were worth standing for, even when standing was hard. The anthem reached its peak, the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. And Earl thought about Iwo Jima, about the flares lighting up the night sky over Suribachi, about Pete Dalton's mouth moving, forming words that Earl had spent 79 years trying to hear. And suddenly, standing there in a high school stadium surrounded by people who had come to honor something bigger than themselves, Earl understood. Pete hadn't been trying to tell him anything complicated, hadn't been delivering some final message that required decoding. He'd been saying what any dying man says to the friend holding him. Thank you. I'm glad you're here. Take care of the others. Earl's vision blurred. He didn't wipe his eyes. He just stood there, hand over heart, letting the tears fall while the anthem played and his grandson watched, and 100 veterans stood beside him in solidarity. The song ended. The crowd erupted in applause, not for the anthem itself, but for what had just happened, for the moment they'd all been part of. Earl lowered himself back onto the bench, his legs shaking, his heart full. Manny put a hand on his shoulder. You okay? Better than okay. Earl pulled out the photograph, 23 men in Marine uniforms, grinning at the camera. I think I finally figured something out. Before Manny could respond, a commotion near the aisle drew their attention. Someone was pushing through the crowd, moving against the flow of people settling back into their seats. Earl tensed, expecting trouble. A reporter, maybe, or worse, another deputy with another complaint. It was Catherine Hawkins. She looked different than she had a week ago. The blazer was gone, the pearls were gone, the campaign button was gone. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, and her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept well in days. She stopped at the end of Earl's row, hesitating like she wasn't sure she had the right to come any closer. Mr. Jessup. The veterans around Earl shifted, a protective movement that was more instinct than decision. Manny half rose from his seat, his body language making clear that any trouble would be met with resistance. It's all right, Earl said quietly. Let her talk. Hawkins took a breath. I came to apologize, publicly if you'll let me, for what I said last week, for... She faltered, glanced at the crowd watching her with expressions ranging from skeptical to hostile. For a lot of things. You filed a complaint trying to have us removed. I did, and I'm withdrawing it tonight. I've already called the sheriff's office. She met Earl's eyes, and he saw something there he hadn't expected, genuine remorse, raw and unpolished. I have a father. He served in Vietnam. Her voice broke. He has Parkinson's. His hands shake like yours, and I've spent so many years being embarrassed by it, trying to manage it, trying to make him less visible, because his condition makes me uncomfortable. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. When I saw you standing there, trembling, I didn't see a war hero. I saw my own shame, and I took it out on you. The stadium had gone quiet around them. Somewhere below, the referee was blowing a whistle, the game officially starting, but no one in the veterans section was watching. That doesn't excuse what I did, Hawkins continued. Nothing excuses it. But I wanted you to know that I understand now why I did it, and I'm sorry. For my father's sake, for yours, for all the men and women who came home carrying wounds we couldn't see, She looked at the rows of veterans surrounding Earl. "I'm withdrawing from the commissioner's race tonight. I don't deserve to represent people I don't understand." Earl studied her for a long moment. The anger was still there, probably always would be, but something else was there too. The recognition that pain made people do ugly things, and that understanding the ugliness didn't require forgiving it, but it did require acknowledging it. "Sit down," he said finally. Hawkins blinked. "What?" "There's a seat next to my daughter, 3rd row down." Earl gestured toward Linda, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "Sit down and watch the game. That's what we're all here to do." I'm not sure I should." "Lady, I spent 79 years learning that the only way forward is through. You can run from what you did, or you can sit in these stands with the people you wronged and figure out how to be better." He paused. "Your choice." Hawkins stood frozen for a moment. Then, slowly, she made her way down to the 3rd row, where Linda shifted to make room. The two women sat side by side, strangers, bound by a moment neither of them had expected. Manny let out a low whistle. That was something. That was necessary. Earl tucked the photograph back into his pocket, next to Clara's ring. "Holding grudges takes energy I don't have anymore. Doesn't mean I forget. Just means I'd rather spend what time I've got standing for something than standing against someone." On the field, the game was underway. Tyler was everywhere, making tackles, chasing down runners, playing with a ferocity that Earl recognized. The boy was fighting for something now, fighting because he understood what it meant to have people in the stands who believed in him. At halftime, Principal Howard took the microphone and announced the first annual Fredericksburg Veterans Appreciation Night. She called veterans to the field by service branch, and they came. A parade of old men and young ones, women in wheelchairs and men on prosthetics, all of them walking onto the grass while the crowd stood and cheered. Earl went last, supported by Manny on one side and Tyler on the other, his grandson having run from the locker room, still in uniform, to help him down the bleacher steps. They stood at the 50-yard line, the three of them, while the band played "America the Beautiful" and the crowd sang along. Earl's legs trembled, his heart pounded, but he didn't fall. "Grandpa," Tyler said, his voice thick, "I'm proud of you." Earl put his hand on his grandson's shoulder, those steady young shoulders that would carry so much in the years ahead. "I'm proud of you too, son. Every single day." The song ended. The crowd roared, and somewhere in the stands, Catherine Hawkins was crying quietly while Linda handed her a tissue. Earl let Tyler help him back to his seat. The second half passed in a blur of touchdowns and tackles, the Billies winning by 3 touchdowns in what the local paper would later call the most spirited game in recent memory. But Earl wasn't watching the scoreboard. He was watching the stands, the veterans who had come from across Texas to stand with him, the families who had made room, the politician who had apologized and the daughter who had stayed despite her fears, and the grandson who was playing his heart out under the Friday night lights. This was what Pete had been trying to tell him. Not goodbye, not some final wisdom. Just this. You're not alone. You never were. After the game, the riders gathered in the parking lot to say their farewells. Handshakes and hugs, promises to stay in touch, the exchange of phone numbers and club patches, and stories that would be told for years. Earl stood in the middle of it all, overwhelmed in a way he hadn't expected. Manny found him near the edge of the crowd, watching the last families filter out of the stadium. "Hell of a night," Manny said. "Hell of a week." Earl turned to face him. "What are you going to do now? Keep writing?" "For a while, but I was thinking—" Manny hesitated, something vulnerable in his eyes. "I was thinking about calling my daughter, Sophia. She's only 3 hours from here. I haven't seen her in 6 months." "You should call her." "Yeah." Manny looked at his phone like it might have answers he was afraid to hear. "I don't know if she wants to see me. I've let her down a lot." "Then show up anyway." Earl put his hand on the younger man's arm. "That's what I learned tonight. Showing up is the thing. Even when you're scared, even when you've let people down, you show up and you stand and you let them see that you're trying." He smiled slightly. "Worst case, she tells you to leave. Best case, she hands you a tissue and lets you cry." Manny laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "That's the wisdom of 89 years? That's the wisdom of one very long week." Earl released his arm. "Go call your daughter, son. The road will still be there tomorrow." Manny nodded slowly. Then he pulled Earl into a hug. Brief, fierce, the kind of embrace soldiers gave each other when words weren't enough. "Take care of yourself, Earl." "You too, Roadhouse." Manny walked back to his bike, phone already in his hand. Earl watched him dial, watched him put the phone to his ear, watched his face change as someone on the other end answered. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw Manny's shoulders drop, saw the tension drain out of him, saw him lean against his bike and talk for a long time. Tyler appeared at Earl's side, still in his uniform, grass stains on his jersey. "Ready to go home, Grandpa?" Earl looked at his grandson, at the parking lot emptying around them, at the stadium lights flickering off one by one. "Yeah," he said, "I'm ready." They walked to the truck together, the old man and the young one, while the Texas stars came out overhead and the sound of a single motorcycle faded into the September night. The second Friday in November, Earl made his way up the bleachers for the final home game of the season. His walker clanked against the aluminum steps the same as always, but this time he wasn't alone. Linda walked beside him, one hand ready to steady him if he faltered. Tyler had offered to help, but Earl had waved him off. The boy had a championship to prepare for, and Grandpa's didn't need that much assistance. Not yet, anyway. The cold had arrived early this year, hill country winter settling into the bones of the town like an old friend. Earl wore his VFW jacket over 2 sweaters, Clara's ring pressed against his chest in its usual spot. The photograph was there too, softened by months of handling, 23 faces he could trace with his eyes closed. His usual seat was occupied when he reached it by Manny Delgado, who stood and stepped aside with a grin. "Saved your spot," Manny said. "Figured you'd want the view." "What are you doing here? Thought you were in Austin." "Was. Came back for the game." Manny gestured to the aisle, where a teenage girl with dark hair and her mother's eyes was making her way up the steps, 2 cups of hot chocolate balanced in her hands. "Sophia wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Told her I knew a guy." Earl looked at the girl. 14, Manny had said, though she seemed older in the way kids did when they'd been through things. She reached the row and handed 1 cup to her father, then turned to Earl with a shy smile. "You're the Marine from the videos," she said. "Dad talks about you all the time." "Does he now?" "He says you taught him something important, about showing up." Sophia glanced at Manny, something complicated in her expression. Love and hurt and hope all tangled together. "We're working on that, both of us." Earl settled into his seat and accepted the hot chocolate Linda pressed into his hands. The stands were filling fast, families claiming their spots, the band warming up on the track below. It felt the same as every other Friday night, and completely different. Because scattered throughout the crowd, he could see them, veterans in leather vests, men and women who had been here that night in September and had kept coming back. Not 100 anymore, just a handful, but enough. Enough to remember, enough to stand. Catherine Hawkins was in the stands too, 3 sections over, sitting with her father, an old man in a wheelchair whose hands shook worse than Earl's. She'd brought him to every game since that night, pushing his chair up the accessible ramp, sitting beside him in the front row where he could see. She caught Earl's eye once, early in the first quarter, and gave a small nod. He nodded back. That was all. That was enough. She hadn't run for commissioner after all. The story Earl heard was that she'd gone back to teaching instead, middle school history, trying to help kids understand the wars she'd spent so long avoiding. Whether it was true or not, Earl didn't know. He just knew that some falls led somewhere better, and some people found the courage to change, not everyone, but some. At halftime, Principal Howard announced the 2nd annual Veterans Appreciation Night. This time it was official, school board approved, complete with a ceremony and a scholarship fund established in the name of the 5th Marine Division. Earl had tried to refuse the honor, but Linda and Tyler had overruled him. "It's not about you," Tyler had said, with the straightforward wisdom of 17. "It's about all of them, the ones who came home and the ones who didn't." So Earl stood at the 50-yard line again, flanked by Manny and 3 other veterans who had ridden in from across the state. The band played the Marines' hymn, and the crowd sang along to the parts they knew. When it was over, Earl raised his trembling hand in a salute that was half muscle memory and half goodbye, to Pete Dalton, to the men in the photograph, to Clara watching from wherever she was now. "You okay, Dad?" Linda asked when he returned to his seat, breathless and shaking. "I'm good." He squeezed her hand. "Better than I've been in a long time." Tyler played the game of his life that night. 2 interceptions, a dozen tackles, a hit so clean the scouts in the crowd started taking notes. The Billies won the district championship by 10 points, and when the final whistle blew, Tyler found his grandfather in the stands and pointed to him, the way athletes did when they wanted to dedicate a moment to someone who mattered. Earl pointed back. After the game, the 4 of them walked to the parking lot together. Earl, Linda, Manny, and Sophia. The girl had spent the second half asking questions about Iwo Jima, about the Marines, about things Earl had never told anyone except Clara and Tyler. He'd answered as honestly as he could. The war had been hell. The men had been brothers. Some of them had made it out, and some hadn't, and the ones who survived had spent their whole lives trying to be worthy of the ones who didn't. "That's why you stand," Sophia said, not a question. "For them. That's why I stand." Manny's bike gleamed under the parking lot lights, chrome polished bright. He'd ridden down from Austin with Sophia on the back, her first time on a motorcycle, a trust rebuilt 1 mile at a time. They had a long ride ahead of them, but neither seemed in a hurry to leave. "Same time next year?" Manny asked, shaking Earl's hand. "Lord willing. I'll hold you to that." Manny turned to Linda. "Take care of him. He's a stubborn old man, but he's worth the trouble." Linda smiled. A real smile, the first easy one Earl had seen from her since Clara's funeral. "I know he is." Manny and Sophia rode off into the November dark, the motorcycle's rumble fading into the sound of wind through the live oaks. Earl stood in the parking lot with his daughter, watching the last families filter toward their cars, feeling the particular peace that came after things ended well. "Dad," Linda said quietly, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For trying to put you somewhere you didn't belong, for thinking you were fragile when you were just—" She searched for the word. "Grieving, differently than I was. We all grieve different, sweetheart. Your mama understood that." "I'm starting to." She linked her arm through his, steadying him without making it obvious. "I'm not giving up on the assisted living thing forever, but maybe not yet, maybe not for a while." Earl patted her hand. "That's all I'm asking, a little more time to stand on my own." They walked to the truck together, past the empty bleachers and the dark scoreboard, and the field where his grandson had just won a championship. The stands would fill again next fall, and Earl intended to be there, trembling hands, bad knees, and all. Because that's what you did. You showed up, you stood, you honored the ones who couldn't stand anymore by standing for them. He climbed into the passenger seat and let Linda drive him home, through the quiet streets of Fredericksburg, past the houses decorated for the holidays, under the stars that had watched over this town for 200 years. His pocket, the photograph weighted soft as cloth. 23 men who had been young once, who had grinned at a camera without knowing what was coming. Earl touched it through the fabric and made the same promise he'd made every night since 1945. "I'll stand for you. As long as I can. I'll stand." If this story moved you, subscribe so you never miss one. And tell us in the comments, what do you stand for? We read every answer.